The Ghosts of Alcatraz, Why This Prison is Still Haunted. If you're new here, subscribe and stay close. The darkest stories always surface when you least expect them. And tonight, we're going inside a place that never forgets. The alarm was still echoing across the empty cell block when the first ranger reached the end of Broadway, breath sharp in the cold morning air. He had patrolled Alcatraz Island for 15 years and thought he'd seen everything the abandoned prison could offer. The creaking doors, the shifting metal, the way the wind sometimes sounded like a man whispering through the bars. But nothing prepared him for the sight in front of cell 13. The steel door, locked the night before, was standing open. A folded prison uniform, stiff with seawater, lay neatly on the floor. And on the back wall, old and faded but unmistakable, was a message scratched into the paint long before the prison closed: "We never left." At first, the ranger froze, unsure what part of what he saw threatened him more: the open cell that shouldn't be open, or the uniform that looked like it had just risen from the bottom of the bay. The last registered inmates of Alcatraz had been transferred out in 1963. No one had legally lived or slept in these cells in 6 decades. Yet there he stood, staring at a piece of fabric that smelled of salt and rust, as if it had drifted straight from the infamous 1962 escape. He radioed for backup, but his voice shook enough that dispatch asked if he needed medical attention. He didn't answer. Something in that cold hallway told him the story was bigger than a routine disturbance. By the time investigators arrived, the island was still wrapped in fog thick enough to blur the lighthouse. They studied the uniform first. Not a replica, not a prop left behind by tourists, but an authentic federal-issue garment manufactured in the early 1960s. The tag alone proved that. But what disturbed them more was the moisture in the seams. It wasn't fresh rainwater. It was older, heavier, like the kind collected from decades of ocean mist and storage in a place with no light. None of the rangers could explain how it ended up inside a locked cell. And none wanted to acknowledge the deeper question that investigators now whispered among themselves. Was this somehow connected to the most famous unsolved escape in American criminal history? 2 days later, the case grew stranger. A tourist from Ohio reported hearing what sounded like metal clanking inside the utility corridor behind cell block B, a place permanently sealed for safety. She didn't think much of it until a second visitor, from Germany, reported the exact same sound an hour later. Rangers ran a sweep of the corridor, expecting to find loose pipes or shifting beams. They found nothing. But they did find dusty footprints, size 11, leading away from the sealed door, then stopping abruptly halfway down the hall. No smears, no direction, no sign of anyone climbing or jumping. It was as if the person simply vanished. Federal authorities took control after that. They didn't want rumors, they didn't want press, and they especially didn't want conspiracy theorists flooding social media. They invited a small team of historical crime researchers, people who understood the prison's history better than anyone alive, to assess whether this was a prank, a misunderstanding, or something tied to Alcatraz's violent past. Among them was Elena Ward, a documentary investigator who had spent her career studying cold cases involving America's most dangerous inmates. She wasn't easily shaken, but her first step onto the island gave her the same uneasy feeling she had only experienced while interviewing death row inmates. Something about the silence felt heavy, like the walls were carrying memories no one had asked to hear. Elena walked through the empty recreation yard, listening to the distant waves slamming into the rocks. She had studied hundreds of photos from the prison's active years: guards standing stiff with rifles, inmates pacing in slow circles, and the infamous escape hole carved from the back of a cell. But seeing the island in person made everything feel sharper. She stopped near the old mess hall, noticing a rusted tray on the ground. It was too clean compared to everything else around it, almost as if someone had placed it there recently. She crouched to examine it, and the moment her fingers touched the metal, a gust of wind pushed the hanging door against the frame with a loud, hollow bang. Elena flinched and stood up fast, scanning the yard. Nobody was there. To build a timeline, her team dug into archived reports, old guard logs, and transcripts from inmates who once walked those cells. What they found painted a picture more intense than any legend. Alcatraz wasn't haunted by spirits, it was haunted by human suffering. Hundreds had lived inside those concrete walls, and some had never made it out alive. Guards wrote about hearing men talking to themselves for hours in solitary. Inmates described the silence as a punishment you could feel in your bones. Even some guards, years later, admitted the place made them feel watched, even when they were alone. Still, none of that explained the fresh evidence showing up in 2025. The footprints, the uniform, the open cell. Someone, or something driven by very real human motives, had been inside areas that were supposed to be locked and empty. As Elena continued her investigation, she noticed that every piece of strange evidence tied back to one thing: the 1962 escape. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were the only men to ever outsmart the Rock. Their disappearance had sparked decades of debate. Did they drown in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, or did they make it to shore, vanishing into civilian life? No bodies were ever found and no confirmed sightings were ever verified. Yet here on the island, the faintest echo of their story was reappearing, like someone wanted their legacy to rise again. Late one evening, Elena returned alone to cell block B, long after the other investigators had gone back to the mainland. She wanted to recheck the corridor. As she stepped inside, the air felt colder than before, enough to make her breath visible. She moved her flashlight along the floor and stopped dead when the beam hit something small wedged near the concrete wall, a triangular scrap of handmade rubber. Not modern rubber. Not synthetic. But the exact type prisoners had once used to create homemade shoes that wouldn't leave footprints as they escaped. Her heart hammered. She placed a glove on her hand, gently lifted the scrap and studied it. It matched archival photos almost perfectly. She recorded her findings, but as she stood up, a soft metallic click echoed behind her. She turned sharply. The corridor door, the same sealed door that hadn't moved in decades, was slowly drifting open. Elena froze. The door stopped halfway, motionless. No footsteps followed. No voice. Just silence stretching down the hallway. Carefully, she stepped toward the doorway, the rubber scrap still in her hand. She pushed it the rest of the way open and raised her flashlight. The beam landed on something she wished she had never seen. Sitting in the dust in the center of the sealed corridor was a small, water-stained envelope, addressed to the U.S. Marshal Service, sealed, dated, and marked with a name the world hadn't seen in over 60 years. A name that shouldn't be inside a place sealed since 1963. Elena leaned closer, reading the faded ink, and her knees nearly buckled. It was signed by one of the escapees. And the letter inside wasn't old. It was written only 3 months ago. If you're still here, make sure you're subscribed, because the deeper we go, the darker this story becomes. And this section is where the island starts talking back. Elena didn't open the envelope right away. For a long moment she just stood there, frozen in the sealed corridor with her flashlight trembling in her hand. The date alone didn't make sense. The handwriting was steady, clean, almost deliberate. Not shaky like someone elderly. Not rushed like someone hiding. Whoever wrote this had taken their time. And that meant something even harder to believe. Someone connected to the 1962 escape had either survived far longer than anyone expected, or someone wanted investigators to think they did. She slipped the envelope carefully into an evidence bag and backed out of the corridor, refusing to turn her back on the emptiness behind her. The moment she stepped into the main block, she exhaled. Even in its silence, cell block B felt safer than whatever was happening inside that sealed hallway. When she reached the yard, she finally radioed the mainland. "I need extraction," she said, her voice tight. "And I need federal eyes on standby. Tell them I found something unusual." By the time Elena boarded the last boat off the island, the fog was already crawling back in, curling against the cells like a living thing. She watched Alcatraz fade behind her, its cold outline swallowed by gray seawater and passing mist. But her mind wasn't on the view. It was on the envelope sitting silently in her bag, waiting to be opened. Back on shore, she met with federal agents. The kind who didn't wear uniforms, didn't introduce themselves, and didn't like questions. They escorted her into a secure room, placed the evidence on the table, and nodded for her to begin. Elena put on gloves, lifted the envelope, and slowly slid a letter out. The paper was yellowed at the edges but not aged enough to match the 1960s. A faint smell of seawater clung to it, the same scent she had found in cell 13 beside the uniform. She unfolded the page, hands steady, heart pounding, and began reading aloud. The letter was short, too short for a confession, too long for a prank. It spoke of 3 men, cold water, strong currents, and a plan that almost didn't work. It mentioned hiding, splitting up, and letting the world believe what it wanted. But the last lines were the part that sent a quiet shiver through the room. If you're reading this, then everything has changed. Someone is back where he shouldn't be. And he's not done yet. Don't trust the stories. The truth is still on the island. There was no signature. No name. Just a coded mark that matched old escape documents. A triangular shape almost identical to the homemade shoe scrap Elena had found. The agents whispered among themselves, arguing over authenticity. Some believed the letter was recent but meaningless. Others believed it was a message. a warning from someone who knew the escape story far better than anyone alive. Elena sat quietly, staring at the final line. Someone is back where he shouldn't be. If that was true, then something was happening on Alcatraz, something real, something dangerous, something unfolding step by step without anyone noticing. Federal authorities decided to return to the island the next morning with more manpower. But Elena didn't sleep that night. Alone in her hotel room, she reviewed photos from the day, the footprints, the rubber scrap, the open cell, the uniform. None of these things felt random. None of them fit the usual pattern of tourists sneaking around or rangers misplacing artifacts. Instead, they hinted at a calculated trail, as if someone wanted her there, wanted investigators to follow, wanted something old and buried to surface again. At sunrise, the team returned to Alcatraz. The water around the island was rough, the current pushing hard against the boat as if resisting their arrival. When they landed, they spread out, searching for anything out of place. Fresh prints, tools, disturbed dust, broken locks. The prison felt different in daylight, less haunting, more hollow. Yet the air still had that same heavy pressure, like the island was waiting for something. In the administrative building, Elena found a stack of untouched files stored in a steel cabinet. Most were routine guard memos, inmate rosters, maintenance logs. But one folder stood out, a packet labeled Post-Escape Evaluations Restricted. Inside were handwritten notes from guards who had been on duty the night of the 1962 breakout. They described something few documentaries ever mentioned, a fourth man. Not part of the official escape. Not confirmed. Just rumors whispered among inmates, a man who planned to escape but never made it out of his cell. He wasn't famous like Morris or the Anglin brothers. His name never entered the case files. But the guards mentioned him repeatedly. He threatened to come back. He said the island owed him something. He believed the rock kept secrets no one should touch. Elena felt a pit form in her stomach. Was this the someone the letter warned about? Someone who stayed behind? Someone who knew hidden areas the public never saw? Someone who could slip through old corridors unnoticed? Her thoughts were interrupted by a shout from the lower level. She rushed downstairs, following two agents into the old workshop area. One of the metal cabinets, sealed for decades, was open. Inside were newspaper clippings pinned neatly to the wall. They weren't from the 1960s. They were recent. Articles about Alcatraz tours, documentaries, anniversary specials, and rumors of sightings. Someone had been watching the island closely. Someone had been paying attention. On the workbench beneath the clippings lay a small, rusted key. Elena recognized it immediately. It matched the design of keys used for the older mechanical locks on the far end of the prison. Locks that hadn't worked in half a century. But when she picked it up, she felt fresh oil on the metal. Someone had recently used it. The agents exchanged a look of concern. If someone was living on the island, hiding in forgotten rooms, accessing sealed areas, then whatever was happening wasn't supernatural. It was human. And human motives were always more dangerous. Before the team could investigate further, a loud echo rolled through the cell block. A deep, metallic slam that reverberated off the concrete like a warning shot. Everyone froze. The sound came from D Block, the area known for solitary confinement, the area prisoners once called the Dark Hole. They moved toward it, weapons unnecessary but drawn out of fear. The hallway leading to D Block was dim, the single strip of skylight barely lighting the narrow path. Elena stepped carefully, remembering stories of inmates who refused to walk this hall even in daylight. As they approached the final row of cells, she noticed something odd. The door to cell D14, officially sealed since 1963, was slightly open. Inside the cell, dust lay thick on the floor but not untouched. In the center was a faint circle drawn with a fingertip. At first it looked meaningless, but when Elena stepped closer, her heart skipped. The circle wasn't perfect. It had 3 short triangular lines cut into its edge. The same marking from the letter. The same marking from the shoe scrap. Someone had stood in this cell recently, long after the prison had closed. Someone who wanted investigators to know he was still here. As Elena reached out to examine the symbol, a soft clink hit the ground outside the cell. She turned sharply. A piece of metal had rolled to a stop near her boot, a broken piece of an old lock, freshly snapped. She crouched to pick it up. And that's when she saw it. Across the hallway, just beyond the bars of another sealed cell, something glinted in the faint light. She stepped forward slowly, peering into the darkness. There, lying on an old prison mattress, was a photograph, crisp, clean, and printed recently. It showed the view from the island's lighthouse. A photo taken from inside a space that no tourist, ranger, or worker could access today. Someone alive had been climbing the lighthouse. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. And taped to the back of the photo was a short message, written in the same handwriting as the letter. "You're close. But you're not supposed to find me yet." Elena felt the hair on her arms rise. Whoever this person was, he wasn't running. He was leading them. And he wanted them to keep following. If you're still watching, hit subscribe, because the final chapter is where every locked door opens, and not all of them lead out. Elena didn't speak for several seconds. The message on the back of the photograph felt like someone whispering directly into her ear. Whoever was leaving these clues wasn't afraid of being found. He was inviting them, testing them, playing a game that only he seemed to know the rules to. She held the photo a little longer, studying the crisp edges, the angle of the shot, the lighthouse window frame visible in the corner. Whoever took it had steady hands and full access to a place untouched for years. The agents around her exchanged worried looks. "We need to lock down the island," one of them muttered. "Now." But Elena shook her head. "He's already ahead of us," she said quietly. "He knows this place better than any of us ever will. If we rush him, he'll disappear again." They moved out of D Block and returned to the main corridor, mapping every clue, every marking, every sign of recent activity. As they walked, Elena couldn't shake a growing certainty. This wasn't leftover evidence from inmates who escaped in 1962. This wasn't the work of tourists, pranksters, or curious adventurers. This was someone who lived inside the forgotten spaces of Alcatraz. Someone who understood the vents, tunnels, and sealed workshops the way only a once desperate inmate could. And then a thought hit her. What if the man they were looking for wasn't one of the famous escapees, but someone who had been left behind? She returned to the notes about the rumored fourth inmate, the man whose plan never reached the newspapers. Guards had described him as quiet, calculating, someone who observed more than he spoke. A man who believed the island itself held secrets worth discovering. A man who threatened to return if he ever got the chance. If he had survived the chaos of the 1962 breakout, he could have hidden in the one place no one thought to check, Alcatraz itself. The idea sounded impossible, until every clue on the island started pointing in that direction. While agents swept the cell blocks, Elena followed a detail she couldn't ignore. The photograph of the lighthouse. If someone had climbed it recently, there would be signs, scuff marks, disturbed rust, maybe a missing bolt. She made her way toward the tower, passing through narrow hallways and weather-beaten stairwells. The wind pushed against her, cold and sharp, carrying the sound of distant gulls. When she reached the lighthouse door, she found it cracked open just a few inches. That alone was enough to raise her heartbeat. Visitors were never allowed near this place. Rangers rarely checked it anymore. And yet, here it was, unlocked as if waiting for her. She pushed the door open, and a long spiral staircase rose in front of her. Rusted metal, flaking paint, the smell of salt and dust. She climbed slowly, each step groaning beneath her weight. Halfway up she stopped. A strip of fabric was caught on one of the steps, dark, damp, torn at the edge. She tugged it free and realized it matched the prison uniform left in cell 13. Same material. Same stitching. But this piece looked newer, less damaged by time. As she reached the top, the circular room opened into a breathtaking view of the bay. The windows were fogged at the edges, but she could still see the Golden Gate Bridge glowing faintly beneath the rising sun. She walked toward the window, comparing it with the photograph. Same angle. Same height. Whoever took the photo had stood exactly where she was standing. On the windowsill, something small caught her eye, a scrap of paper weighted down with a tiny bolt. She lifted it gently. Just a few words, written with the same steady hand. Almost there. Elena's pulse drummed in her ears. Someone was guiding her to something bigger. Something final. She turned back toward the door, but before she could take a step, a loud crack echoed from below, the unmistakable snap of metal under pressure. The staircase shuddered. Dust rained down. She dropped to her knees just as a section of the stairs collapsed, crashing onto the level below. If she had been standing there 2 seconds earlier, she would have gone with it. She steadied herself, breathing hard. That wasn't an accident. That was a warning. Or a test. With the path down partially blocked, she radioed for help. Agents rushed to her rescue, clearing the broken metal and escorting her safely to the ground. But Elena knew the message wasn't meant to harm her. It was meant to push her forward. Back on solid ground, she studied the map of the island once more. Every clue formed a trail, from cell 13 to the sealed corridor to D Block to the lighthouse. But one location stood out, the old utility tunnel beneath the prison. A forgotten passageway that connected major sections of the island, built long before Alcatraz became a federal prison. Most people didn't even know it existed. It had been sealed for safety decades ago. But someone with knowledge of the island's original blueprints could use it to move unseen. Elena moved quickly, leading the team toward the basement entrance. When they pried open the rusted metal door, cold air rushed out, carrying the scent of earth and old water. The tunnel was pitch black, long and silent. As they stepped inside, their flashlights revealed a narrow path lined with old pipes. Dust lay thick on the ground, except for one stretch, where the dirt had been clearly disturbed. Fresh footprints. Size 11. The same size as the ones found near cell block B. They followed the prints deep into the tunnel until they reached a fork in the path. The prints continued to the right, but a small note was taped to the left wall, barely visible under years of grime. Elena wiped it clean and read the message aloud. Wrong way. Stay on the path. Whoever wrote it wasn't trying to hide. He was directing them. The team continued forward until the tunnel opened into a small chamber, a dead end. But on the far wall, someone had pinned dozens of documents, maps, photographs, and clippings. It looked like a command center. A place someone had built slowly, carefully, over years. Articles about Alcatraz's history. Copies of the escape reports. Surveillance photos of rangers. Even recent pictures of Elena and the investigative team arriving on the island. Her breath caught. He had been watching them since day one. On the center of the wall was a large piece of paper, blank except for a single sentence written in black ink. I never escaped. I adapted. A metallic thud echoed behind them. The team spun around. The tunnel entrance had closed. Someone had locked them in. Elena raced to the door, pounding on the metal, but it wouldn't budge. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the chamber. And then she saw it, a small figure standing at the far end of the adjoining tunnel, just beyond the edge of the light. Tall, completely still, barely visible. He didn't move. He just watched. Elena stepped back, heart slamming against her ribs. The figure tilted his head slightly, almost curious, almost familiar, as if he had spent decades waiting for someone to finally catch up to him. And then, without a sound, he stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared. The agents forced the door open minutes later, but the figure was gone. The tunnel was empty. No footprints. No sound. No trace. Only one thing remained, a fresh note lying on the floor where he had stood. I left clues so you'd follow. But not to find me. To find the truth. Beneath the sentence was a map of the island, and a single red X marked deep beneath the prison, in a place no one had explored in decades. Elena stared at the mark. Whatever was buried there was the real secret. And now, they had no choice but to dig it up. Because the ghosts of Alcatraz weren't supernatural. They were the kind that walked on 2 feet. And one of them was still alive.